Organisations that have been successful at open source compliance are ones that have created and operated their own open source compliance programs, consisting of policies, processes, training and tools. And it's all in order to achieve the following: facilitate effective usage of open source in their products and projects. There is a huge range of high quality, well-supported open source code available. A well-considered open source compliance program will make it as easy as possible for the developers to select the most appropriate of these components, ensure that they're available under licenses that are suitable for the organization's chosen use case, understand clearly the basis on which they may be used, and encourage involvement with relevant open source projects and the project's community. Contribute to and participate in open source communities. Involvement with communities will facilitate access to support and assistance, lead to further development of bug fixes to the code which can benefit all users, and ultimately give participants an opportunity to influence the future development of the project. Compliance practices consist of more than preparing a policy and processes. It is also necessary to ensure that the policy and processes are appropriate for the organisation or business unit, and crucially have management buy-in and are supported by sufficient staff and resources to handle a number of compliance-related tasks. Identification of the origin and applicable licenses. Identify the origin and applicable license of all software sourced from outside the business and any constraints and obligations applicable to software that has been developed internally. Tracking open source software within a development process. For example, components used in a specific project may be test suites, tools, or code that are not included in a distributed binary. However, there may be situations where you are required to provide these components due to license requirements that apply to the distributed binary. It is also important to record which version of a component is used, as sometimes the license varies from version to version of the same component. Performing open source practices review and identifying license obligations. Conduct regular review of the practices and procedures, ideally with tests of the processes to confirm that they are effective and allow them to be refined. Fulfillment of license obligations when the product is distributed. The conditions in most open source licenses apply at the point of distribution. Accordingly, it is necessary to ensure that those obligations are fulfilled, such as the obligation to retain attribution notices or the offer to provide source. Sometimes these obligations will apply in other cases. For example, some licenses apply obligations when the functionality of the software is available to third parties over the internet, even if the software itself is not distributed. Oversight for open source compliance program and creation of policy and compliance decisions. Alongside the necessity for regular review we previously mentioned, it is equally necessary to ensure that there is effective oversight of the operation of the policy and a mechanism to ensure queries about code usage and incorporation, both from inside and outside the company, to be able to be handled. Any decisions should be recorded, both so as to streamline the resolution of similar queries in the future, but also so that the overall effectiveness of the compliance program can be checked and improved over time. Training. In order for a program to be effective, participants should be appropriately trained. The training should be recorded and assessed, and there is no necessity for everyone to have the same training. Training should be tailored to each relevant role. Benefits of a robust open source compliance program include 1. Increased understanding of the benefits of open source and how it impacts your organization. 2. Increased understanding of the costs and risks associated with using open source. 3. Increased knowledge of available open source solutions. 4. Reduction and management of legal risk. 5. Increased respect for open source developers and owners' licensing choices. 6. Fostering relationships with the open source community and open source organizations. Depending on the open source licenses involved, your compliance obligations may consist of 1. Attribution and notices. You may need to provide or retain copyright and license text in the source code and/or product documentation or user interface so that downstream users know the origin of the software and their rights under the licenses. You may also need to provide notices regarding modifications or full copies of the license. Notice of amendment. You may need to record and notify recipients of the code if it has been modified from the original version you received. The extent to which the changes have to be notified varies from license to license. From a simple requirement to note that changes have been made, to ensuring that the changelog of the software has to be maintained in the software package. 3. Source code availability. You may need to provide source code for the open source software, for modifications you make, for combined or linked software, and scripts that control the build process. These obligations may continue even after the production and sale of the product or services is complete. 4. Medium of source code availability. You may also need to provide source code for the open source software and related modifications, i.e. either by upstreaming, uploading the code to the original open source software repository, complying under terms and conditions of the repository for such uploads or contributions, or if distributing to other users, by providing a channel, for example a downloadable URL or attached file of the code, from where the code can be obtained. 5. Reciprocity. You may need to ensure that modified versions or derivative works are made available and released under the same license that governs the open source component. 6. Other terms. The open source license may have other obligations or conditions, and these can be terms that may touch upon topics like patent grants to you or from you, and the open source license may restrict the use of the copyright holder name or trademark, may require modified versions to use a different name to avoid confusion, or may terminate upon any breach. For some open source licenses, access via a computer network can trigger the license conditions. For example, in the case of applications downloaded to a user's machine or mobile device, and JavaScript, web client, or other code that is downloaded to the user's machine or browser. All versions of the Affero General Public License require providing modified source code if users interact with it remotely through a computer network. Open source license compliance issues that may occur with untracked modifications. An example is that changes to the existing program, for example additions, deletions of code in a file, combining components together, may be subject to additional obligations upon distribution, such as providing a notice of modification or providing the accompanying source code.